Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this series on making your music feel more alive and organic. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'd recommend starting there so you can follow along. I also want to briefly mention that you can grab all the project stems, sounds and bonus samples for this video on my Patreon, alongside full track breakdown videos where I go deep into how I create, mix and master my music. Now let's hit that subscribe button and dive straight back into the project. Alright, now that we have our drums and some basic chords laid down, it's time to bring in the bass. I've set up a MIDI clip here that basically mirrors the bass notes of the piano chords, and I added a simpler loaded with an evolving bass drone that I recorded on my Moog synthesizer. This recording is just a single C note that I played while tweaking a few parameters like the filter cutoff and the drive to create a gradual evolution over time. Of course, you can achieve a similar effect with a software synth. The main idea here is just to have a long evolving drone. And to avoid having to re-pitch it later, it's best to play a C. I'll include my recording as an attachment to this video so you can use it if you'd like. Now let's make the rhythm of this bass line a little more interesting. Instead of using these long legato notes, I'll switch things up a bit by turning each note into a more rhythmic pattern with notes that are 3/16 each. We'll dive into the filter global section of our sampler and then set up a short filter envelope, and I'll let the bass line run while I edit. And actually, I'm gonna make the amp envelope a little shorter too. Now let's add some modulation. I'm gonna use LFO2 to modulate the sample offset with a sine wave over the course of 2 bars. You could also use a random wave to create variation throughout the entire song, but for a prominent element like the bass line, I prefer sticking to a consistent pattern that gives a listener something to anchor to. Feel free to mess around with the modulation amount and pick a value that you like. I'll go for around 20 here. You can hear and see that the sine wave LFO is making the playhead move up and down throughout the bass drone recording, creating a slightly different texture for every note. I increased the LFO amount a bit to make it cover a wider section of our bass drone. Now let's add some more modulation and route the velocity handles to the filter envelope amount. We'll set this to 100 and make sure that our velocity is unmapped from the volume of our bass notes. So you want to make sure that this value here is set at 0%. Cool, so now that we've set the handles at the bottom to control only the filter envelope amount rather than the bass note levels, we can begin creating a dynamic pattern. And this approach allows us to easily and rapidly create a very expressive modulation. Next, I'm gonna add some syncopation to this pattern by splitting certain notes into shorter ones and moving them up a few semitones or an octave. With the bass pattern in place, we can now play around with the filter envelope amount. So the higher we set the handle now, the more the filter envelope will open up. And I'm going to adjust it so it opens fully whenever these shorter high notes hit, creating a nice accent in this bass pattern. Now let's play around with the handles and try to come up with something that we like. Feel free to experiment with the velocity settings in the bottom left, such as the ramp parameters, which are especially fun to play with. And if you're feeling stuck, just hit the randomize button for some fresh ideas. Alright, now let's hear it. I'm gonna reshape it a little by dipping out some of the nasally frequencies, and then I'll also add in some high end to make it sound a little crunchy. Next, I'll copy the sidechain compressor from the piano and apply it to the bass. This will create space for the kick in the frequency spectrum by ducking the bass whenever the kick hits. But it also helps the bass line groove along nicely with the piano to the drums. I'll set the release to auto to ensure the bass smoothly rises back only after the kick has fully played. Now let's listen to it with the piano and the drums. Alright, this is shaping up pretty nicely. I feel like it's becoming a solid backbone to build on and start arranging. At this point, I think adding in some shorter melodic hits could really enhance it, so let's see what we can pull off here. A great way to create an expressive and dynamic synth pattern is through resampling. I'm gonna start by loading up Arturia's Juno synthesizer plugin and copying over the MIDI chords from the piano. I'll search for a smooth pad sound with a bit of brightness to it to contrast the darker tones of the piano and the bass line, which will add depth and movement to the overall mix. This Celestial Homeland preset has a pretty epic vibe, so let's go with that and make a few tweaks. I'll turn off the built-in delay, open up the filter a bit for some extra brightness, and disable the sub-oscillator, since the bassline we just made is already covering the low end of this musical idea. By clicking the Configure button in the VST submenu, we can add any parameter we click on to the plugin's automation panel. I'll add the filter frequency and resonance and a couple of arpeggiator parameters to shape the sound and give it some movement. Then I'll group the Juno plugin so we can assign all of these parameters to macro dials. The reason I map these parameters to macros is so I can randomize them with the device randomizer, which only works on macros and not on individual parameters. Now let's map the randomizer to our instrument rack to start randomizing all the macros. I'll speed up the randomization for a more dynamic modulation. To keep the filter's resonance from getting out of control and potentially damaging our ears, we can use the map button to limit the modulation range of each parameter. I feel like the modulation speed needs to be a bit faster. Now I want to add some syncopation to this pad and make it feel a bit more locked into the groove. A great way of achieving this is by adding a gate and sidechaining it to the wonky hats we extracted from our Foley recording. Now let's tweak the gate until we get a syncopated choppy sound. I'm gonna freeze and flatten the layer so I can start chopping up the audio. But first, let's scoop out some low end to make room for the bass and add in some extra brightness. I'll create a new audio track to build a choppy chord pattern by dragging and rearranging sections into a rhythmic loop that fit in with the other elements of the track. The key here is to repeat small sections to give the listener an anchor point while switching up the parts in between to keep it interesting and dynamic. After a few minutes of messing around with the audio, I came up with this rhythm. The chops have their own glitchy rhythm, but since we gated them to the hi-hats in the first place, they follow the same pattern in certain sections, which makes the groove feel a bit more intentional and less random. I also copied over the spring reverb from the drums to make the chords a bit more vibey and give them a little character. As you might remember, the spring reverb on the drums was mono, but to make these chords a little more lush, I'm gonna widen it back to stereo. We can use a limiter to boost the loudness, and I'll also copy over the sidechaining from the bass line to make the chords breathe with the track. Placing the compressor before the reverb ensures that only the chords are sidechained, keeping the reverb unaffected. Sweet, now there are two more elements I want to add here. The first one being a simple high string that will act as some kind of common thread throughout the loop. For this, I'm going to use my Prophet Rev 2 synthesizer that I have in front of me here on my desk. I'm gonna high pass the string in order to avoid any low-end rumble, and I'll also copy over the sidechain compressor from another track to make the string feel more connected to the beat. Now, there have been a lot of lo-fi plugins popping up in recent years, but Sketch Cassette has always been my favorite. So let's use it to give the string a bit more character and make it sound a little less perfect. There are plenty of cassette types to choose from here, along with a variety of tweakable parameters. The tape age, for example, affects the filtering, and saturation adds in some nice distorted harmonics. Dropouts add subtle inconsistencies, while Flutter introduces random pitch modulation, both contributing to an authentic worn-out tape feel. Let's automate the flutter and gradually increase it over the last 4 beats for a more organic, evolving feel. Alright, this loop is shaping up nicely as a solid foundation for a full track. Now, it's easy to get stuck in the 4-bar loop phase, but a great way to break out of this is by duplicating the loop and making small edits to already start adding some variation to it. By holding Command-Shift and pressing D, I'm gonna duplicate this section a few times. For the second part, I'll remove the chopped up pad, the string, and the glitchy hats to create a more open, less busy section that we can add new elements to. To create a smooth transition and signal that something's about to change in the track, I'm gonna remove some of the drums right before the new section kicks in. It's sounding pretty solid, but the string cuts off a bit too abruptly for me, so let's smooth it out by adding an echo. Now let's talk briefly about tape echoes. Personally, I'm a huge fan of tape echoes because they add a lot of character compared to digital delays, especially when you push the feedback past 100% and it starts distorting in the most beautiful way. I actually have a modest collection of tape echoes here in my studio, which I'll give you a tour of soon, and I use them on almost every track that I make. Now, aside from their sound, I also love the fact that you can't sync them up perfectly to your DAW's tempo. I always try to match them as closely as possible, but even then, after a few bars, they will always start drifting and go out of sync, which adds a very natural and human feel to a song. Now let's recreate this effect using the UAD EP34 plugin, which is a faithful emulation of the iconic Echoplex delay. To keep it feeling organic, we'll set the delay time in milliseconds instead of syncing it to the project's BPM. The Swiss Army meter that permanently resides on my master bus has a pretty handy submenu that converts BPM to milliseconds or to hertz, allowing me to find the right delay time, but I'm gonna offset it slightly so it drifts just a bit, adding a natural, imperfect feel. Now let's go for a dotted eighth note here, which corresponds to 511.36 milliseconds. Now to create that natural drift, I'll set the EP's delay time slightly slower. This way the delay will appear to be in sync at first, but as the feedback extends, it will gradually drift out. I'll also add some treble to brighten up the delays, which will help bring out the distortion in a lovely way. As I crank up the feedback toward the end of the string clip, the delay will spill over into the next section, adding a beautiful layer of distortion. Beautiful. I absolutely love this atmospheric distorted delay sound, so let's run it again and record the automation of the feedback increasing. The automation lane looks a bit hectic right now with all the dots, but we can simplify the envelope to make it easier to edit later on. Now, the very last thing I want to do here is introduce a new element in the second half of this musical idea to keep the listener engaged. I'll add a saxophone loop from one of my Patreon sample packs, but since it's in D minor and we're in C minor, I'll pitch it down 2 semitones to match the key of our song. Alright, now let's do a final run through of the entire demo that we created and hear all the layers and techniques come together in action. Alright, so those were some tips on how you can make your sounds feel more organic, dynamic and human in Ableton Live by embracing slight imperfections, adding movement with automation and using effects that create natural drift and texture. Hopefully this gives you some inspiration for your own productions, and if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments as usual. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!